Jung talks about the archetype of the great mother. Well, an example of how powerful that archetype is and the way imprinting works. How many people here have ever heard of imprinting, just out of curiosity? Hey, what are you doing at a New Age convention? That's a 20th century idea, imprinting. Oh, you're slumming. Ah, that explains it. There was an orphanage in Greece where they got the idea of having the nurses try to act as substitute mothers, but they didn't want the children imprinting the nurses. I don't know if they used the word imprinting, but they knew that the children might develop bonds with the nurses, so they rotated it. Each nurse would spend a week acting as a mother to one child, and then she'd move on to another child. And they thought that way the children wouldn't form bonds with any of the nurses, which was hazardous because if the children formed bonds with the nurses, there'd be a terrible emotional wrench when the nurse quit her job, went to another hospital or another orphanage or whatnot, or if the children got adopted or got transferred to another orphanage or something. You can't have children forming emotional bonds with nurses because that's an unstable relationship in time. And so they rotated the nurses. It turned out each child imprinted one nurse anyway. Apparently, the infant brain has an archetype of the great mother, and will try to imprint it on anything that comes along. And even if you rotate them, it'll pick one out and imprint that one, which gives you an idea how much we have in common with the European snow goose. Konrad Lorenz got the Nobel Prize in 1973 for his study of imprinting, and a lot of his work was done with the European snow goose. And he discovered that the European snow goose is born with this Jungian archetype. I don't think he ever used the word Jungian archetype, but it's what I call a Jungian archetype of mother goose. One of the goslings imprinted a ping pong ball because it saw a ping pong ball right after it was born, and the mother was not present for some reason, some accident in the experimental farm. And this gosling spent its whole infancy nestling with the ping pong ball. And when it grew up, it followed the ping pong ball everywhere. When it grew up, it tried to mate with the ping pong ball, which gives you an idea of how deep in genetics lies what Freud called the Oedipus complex. There's a similar story from Africa. Somebody observed a baby giraffe that had been, whose mother had been shot by hunters. And the baby giraffe imprinted the hunter's jeep. And it followed the jeep around, tried to nurse from the jeep, which must have been a very frustrating experience. Although, considering the things babies put in their mouths, as I said, you realize how deep this desire to taste the universe is in the newborn of all mammalian species. When the giraffe grew up, it tried to mate with the jeep. Now, this gives you some concept of your Jungian archetypes. Jung said the archetype has no content. The archetype is just a vague general genetic potential. It has no specific content. Apparently, the gosling, wants to find a goose which is roundish and white. And if you can't find a goose, it will imprint something else that's roundish and white, like a ping pong ball. One of Lorenz's experimental birds imprinted him and followed him around all the time and tried to nest with him. That's apparently because he walked on two legs, like a goose does. Aristotle defined human beings as featherless bipeds because we have that thing in common with birds, two legs. Most mammals go around on all fours, as you know, if you've ever observed Congress. The giraffe imprinted the jeep because it had four wheels, I assume, and the giraffe has four legs. Four wheels are close enough to four legs to make an approximation of the archetype. We're all very vulnerable to imprinting right after we're born. If you have a cold and rejecting mother, you'll find somebody who's imprinted the universe as a cold and rejecting place.
Alexa.
And they will eventually end up either in psychiatric treatment or in the Committee for Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal, where that reptilian unemotional level is regarded as normal. The first intelligence test in trying to differentiate your friends from the apes, or to find out how much you are differentiated from the apes, is to figure out what ping pong balls you've imprinted in your course of your life and why you're still compulsively attached to them. The strength of what can happen in points of imprint vulnerability is in what's known as the paradoxical reaction to terrorism. People who've been kidnapped by terrorists often imprint the terrorists. They come out saying, gee, they were really nice guys. Of course, they shot a couple of us and they were threatening to shoot me. But really, I began to realize what nice guys they were, basically. That's called the paradoxical reaction, because it doesn't make sense. If you haven't been kidnapped by terrorists, you can't understand why they're reacting that way. But the terrorists have one thing in common with the ideal mother. They feed you. While you're being held captive by them, they're the ones who are bringing in the food. And it seems that when you're in a situation of utter helplessness, like when you're being held by terrorists or the U.S. Army, or if you even get arrested by the cops, you're in that situation. When you're in a totally helpless position, all higher mental activity seems to cease, and you revert to the oral biosurvival circuit. And you look at who's going to feed me, and how can I please them so they'll go on feeding me and won't kill me. And so you begin imprinting onto the terrorists the great mother archetype, and eventually they become more and more likable guys. When you get a notice in the mail that says the President of the United States sends you greetings, report to your draft board on such and such a morning, you're hauled out of your natural environment. You know that if you run away, they'll pursue you, unless you get over the border to Canada very quickly. And then you can't come back unless you get some president who issues pardons. And there's all sorts of social pressure that tells you shouldn't run away, which is an interesting question. When people are threatening to kidnap and enslave you, why shouldn't you run away? It's the normal, it's a sensible thing to do. We're subject to all sorts of weird imprinting, and most people imprint the government as a mother figure. The Statue of Liberty is a feminine symbol. Columbia is a feminine symbol. The mother country is a word that appears in most languages. Anyway, if you get kidnapped by the army, you find yourself dragged out of your normal environment, held captive by people who have total control over you and who can shoot you for the, quote, crime of desertion. If you say, fuck this, I don't want to put up with this crap, I'm going home and back to my job, or back to goofing off or whatever I was doing, I'm not going to stand for this. You find out they got the right to shoot you, because that's called the crime of desertion. So you start imprinting them as mother figures. And that's the way you become a soldier. If you get put into a prison, you start imprinting the warden and the guards as substitute mother figures, because they feed you. They're responsible for your biosurvival as long as you're there. And that'll get clearer as we go along. Let's move on to the second circuit. After you've spent a year crawling around, tasting everything, the DNA master, this is a great place to perch. I must learn to sit on the arms of couches more often. I'm as smart as my cat gradually. After about a year of crawling around on the biosurvival circuit, recapitulating the earliest stages of evolution, and undoubtedly babies at that stage think about the way the most primitive life forms think. The DNA master tape sends out RNA messenger molecules which run all over the body and signal the various organs, glands, the endocrine systems, and so on, up into the brain too. And you mutate to the next stage of evolution, which is the anal territorial circuit. All of the higher vertebrate species claim territory, and they usually mark it with excretions. Now, Freud noticed this stage of development. He said we start out with oral consciousness, and then with toilet training, we arrive at anal consciousness. Well, it's not the toilet training that does it. Apparently, it's an evolutionary script, because all animals, so all of the higher, more complicated animals, claim territories and mark the territories with excretions. Now, in the human class of life, once you've been kidnapped into an army, your job is to defend the tribal territory, or at least that's what they tell you. Actually, your job is to expand the tribal territory. But they don't say, we're going to go over and grab that country and make it part of our territory. They say that country is threatening us, and we've got to go fight them, so they can't take over our territory. All governments and all wars use the same line. We're defending you against them. And Gurdjieff said we're all in a state of deep hypnosis. If anybody doubts that, if anybody thinks the human race at this stage of evolution is awake, in any realistic meaning of the word awake, just consider the fact that in every war, every government says we're defending ourselves against them. And nobody ever stops and thinks most of them must be lying. They can't all be fighting defensive wars. Some of them must be the aggressors. Why is it my gang are always the defensive ones? Why do I believe that? Have I been hypnotized or something? Or if you think you're rational, why is it the guys on the other side think they're fighting a defensive war? If they're in a state of deep hypnosis to believe that bullshit, is it possible you're in a state of deep hypnosis too? Ouspensky couldn't believe, when he was studying with Gurdjieff, he couldn't believe Gurdjieff's claim that people are in a state of deep hypnosis, sleepwalking all the time, until one day, shortly after the beginning of World War I, Ouspensky was walking through Moscow, and he saw a lorry, a truck. I lived in Ireland for 6 years, and I occasionally lapse back into Irish rather than American. They say lorry, we say truck. They say tomato, we say tomato. Let's call the whole thing off. Ouspensky saw a truck full of artificial legs, wooden legs in those days. Now we got better ones, prosthetic ones. It was heading for the front. And Ouspensky, who was a mathematician who would specialize in statistics, he realized that statistically the government could predict how many legs would be blown off, so they knew how many legs to send up to the front. And he suddenly realized this was only possible if people were mechanisms. Because if people were rational and had free will and free choice and thought for themselves, a lot of people would say, I'm not going up there and get my leg blown off. The reason you can predict how many legs are going to be blown off is because most people are in a deep enough state of hypnosis that they'll do whatever they're told, including going someplace to shoot at total strangers who are going to be shooting back at them for reasons they don't understand. Every border in the world, every national border marks a place where two rival bands of domesticated primates fought until they were exhausted and then made a new territorial mark. Reptiles started the process. Every reptile has a pissing rock. Some species of reptiles, that's where the head reptile lives. Nobody else can piss on that rock. When you get to the mammals, you find they mark their territories by peeing on everything. If you take a dog for a walk, the dog pees every place it can. If you were to make a map of your neighborhood and mark the places where the dog pees, that marks the dog's territory. That's the way the dog claims its territory. Mammals all mark their territories with excretions. Domesticated primates, those who are passing as human but haven't quite achieved human brain functioning yet, mark their territories with ink excretions on paper, which are known as treaties at the end of the war. I know one half of my family came from Ireland. Where the other half of my family came from depends on what period you're talking about. When they left there, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The city they came from was in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but earlier in this century it was in Italy. Now I'm told it's in Yugoslavia. Have they been moving that city? The city is called Trieste. Have they been moving that city around? No, they've just been having fights and redrawing the territorial markers. This is ordinary primate behavior. If human beings consisted of nothing else but the oral biosurvival circuit and the anal territorial circuit, we couldn't distinguish our friends from the apes at all. As a matter of fact, if you look at political behavior, it's kind of hard to see any distinction between human beings and apes at all. Everything seems to be governed by the territorial, by the oral survival circuit and the territorial anal circuit. And people who study politics most profoundly are the most pessimistic people on the planet. John Stuart Mill said, I entered Parliament with what I thought was the lowest possible opinion of the average member. When I left Parliament, that opinion was even lower. The English anarchists have a slogan every election: they vote for Guy Fawkes, the only one who ever entered Parliament with honest intentions. They wanted to blow up Parliament. Around 4 million years ago, the Australopithecines in South Africa began making tools. This is the first time in history that had ever occurred. Chimpanzees occasionally use sticks to knock things down or to reach for things. The Australopithecines started making tools out of stone and carving them to get the right shape. This involves a feedback loop between the left brain and the right hand. Mammals don't have right-left preferences like human beings. Some of the higher primates show a slight tendency to right-handedness part of the time, but it's not consistent. Human beings, we find 90% are right-handed, 10% for some reason are left-handed. This is undoubtedly the result of original sin or something. Well, I don't know. Anthropologically, if you study comparative societies, you find in every society 10% are left-handed, 10% are homosexual. Now, according to Jerry Falwell, the homosexuals have chosen to be that way just because they're pissed off at him and Jesus and want to get him and Jesus irritated. My guess is that left-handedness and homosexuality are genetic programs. I think we are programmed genetically so that a certain percentage of the population, around 10% everywhere in the world, will be left-handed because left-handed people use the right brain more than right-handed people do. And we need 10% of the population at any stage in evolution. We need 10% who are rather right brain just to give us a little proportion. And I assume we need 10% who are homosexual to give us a different perspective on things. And the main quality of homosexuality that makes it an evolutionary survival asset is they don't reproduce. The type 6 homosexuals, according to Kinsey's criteria, type 6, the type who never have heterosexual relations at all. They don't reproduce. What does that mean? That means they're not dragged down by children. That means they have more time to philosophize and play head games and create weird art forms and weird ideas and weird cultures which mutate the whole society. A celibacy was probably developed by the Catholic Church as a substitute for homosexuality because they didn't want to have an overtly homosexual church, so they created a covertly homosexual church by saying, oh, they're all living in celibacy in there. There was an article in a Catholic magazine recently admitting there's a vast gay subculture in all the seminaries in the United States. That's the first time any Catholic publication admitted it. But the function of celibacy, homosexuality, ought to get some people out of the breeding population so that they can think weird thoughts and are not continually concerned with the things that the breeding population are concerned with, namely how to get enough money to support their children. Once you've had children, you have this guilty sense, I can't let them starve. And so your vision tends to get narrowed down to the tunnel vision of how do I get enough money to feed this many people for at least a couple of months ahead, and then after that, how do I get more money to feed them for a few more months ahead? Can I get enough to guarantee that them through college, and so on? That is the necessary quality of the normal heterosexual pattern of the majority throughout history. Which is why there used to be the word gay and straight. Straight implies square, and square implies being utterly preoccupied with these survival issues and not having time to philosophize about the universe in general. Anyway, the Australopithecines made tools. The Neanderthals made even more complicated tools and buried their dead with their heads facing east, which indicates that all this left brain activity was producing abstract ideas. Mammals, as far as I know, don't bury their dead. If they did, I suppose they buried them in random patterns. Burying all of the dead facing east suggests that the Neanderthals must have had some metaphysical doctrine relating to the east and the rising sun. And since the earliest religions we know anything about all have doctrines of resurrection or reincarnation in them, and all worship the rising sun. The earliest Egyptian religion was based on worship of Horus, the lord of two horizons, the rising sun and the setting sun. That was connected with the belief in reincarnation. Ideas like that were probably being invented in Neanderthal days, and that's why they buried the dead with their heads facing the rising sun. The rising sun has always been a symbol of resurrection and new life. Um, the semantic circuit is also a time-binding circuit. Once we've got language, and especially once we've got written language, whether it's going to be Egyptian hieroglyphics, Chinese ideograms, or the alphabet in its Jewish, Arabic, or European forms, any type of written language means that signals can travel through time in a way that is just not possible on the mammalian level. This is where we begin to be able to distinguish our friends from the apes. Theoretically, potentially, even George Bush can receive signals from Socrates. Now, if there was 2,500 years ago a rat who was the rat equivalent of Socrates, a rat of incredible wisdom, one who just didn't go around like the other rats bitching about the wise guys who stuff rat holes with Brillo, but said, let's do something about it. Let's build tools and pull the Brillo out of the rat holes or something like that. And if there was a super rat 2,500 years ago, the rats of today don't know anything about it because they do not have language that transmits ideas across time. I can get signals from Socrates. I can get signals from Confucius. If I have the patience, I can get signals from Confucius in Chinese. All I got to do is spend about 15 years mastering the Chinese language and its intricacies and nuances. If I don't want to spend that much time, I get diluted messages from Confucius by way of English translations. Important units in science are always named after important individuals, like the ohm is named after Ohm, the volt is named after Volta, the farad is named after Faraday, and so on. So I decided to name that after the celebrated Hebrew philosopher who was allegedly born that year, or 4 BC, or sometime around then, Yeshua ben Yosef, whom the Goyim call Jesus Christ. If you turn your television to the channels in the high flight, you find that Jesus Christ needs money. He's real desperate for money, and there's a whole bunch of people on there collecting for him. So I don't know what he needs so much money for when he's been dead 2,000 years, but maybe life on the other plane is just as desperate as it is here. So by 1 AD, all the knowledge from the time the Australopithecines made the first stone implements, all the knowledge that began with the Bronze Age, when somebody in Cambodia discovered if you leave tin and copper in the same fire, you get something out that's neither tin nor copper, bronze, which is much stronger than tin or copper. All the knowledge, they knew 9 chemical elements in Asia before the birth of Christ. We had all of Greek philosophy. Thales proved everything was made out of water. And Democritus proved everything was made out of atoms. And then Heraclitus proved everything was made out of fire. And then Gorgias proved you couldn't prove anything. And Aristotle codified Greek logic and convinced the whole Western world for nearly 2,000 years that that was the only possible form of logic. We didn't learn better until Oriental studies brought us the news that Buddhist logic has 4 values instead of 2, and quantum mechanics developed 3-valued logics. And all of that knowledge up to 1 AD is 1 Jesus on this scale. And how long did it take to double? It took until 1500. In 1500, 8 years after Columbus sailed, and Leonardo da Vinci was 48 years old. In 1500, we had 2 Jesus. We had 2 bits of information for every bit of information we had in 1 AD. Within 17 years, Martin Luther hung his 92 theses on the church. No, 92 theses, I'm sorry. Hey, it would have been more colorful if he hung 92 theses on the church door, wouldn't it? That would be a real surrealist act. Well, the world wasn't ready for surrealism yet. Protestantism was radical enough. That was the first successful Protestant revolution, 17 years after knowledge doubled. Information has consequences. 1 breeding generation, 17 years is a breeding generation, more or less, especially in those days when most people got married in their teens. 17 years later, in 1534, Henry VIII started the second successful Protestant revolution. Europe was plunged into religious wars for 200 years until, for the rational individuals, religion and insanity became virtually synonymous terms. Religion in those days took the form that it still takes in the Mid-East, where, I mean, the religious fanatics are relatively civilized. I know that's hard to believe if you run into them. Like, there's a bunch of them hanging around downstairs warning everybody as they come in, this is the work of the devil. But those people just want to burn books. Do you realize how civilized that is to just burn books? I'm against it. I'm one of the leading opponents of censorship in all forms. But it's so civilized to just burn the books. 300 years ago, they were burning the people who wrote the books. And the Ayatollah Khomeini is still at that level of civilization. The Ayatollah found a book he didn't like, so he put out a contract on the guy who wrote it. Was it 1,000,006 or 5? Now it's 5 million to shoot the guy who wrote that book. Well, that's the way the Catholic Church used to behave. In 1600, they found a book by Giordano Bruno they didn't like, so they burned him alive in Rome. Bruno said to the inquisitors, you have more to fear this day than I have. And indeed, the Catholic Church has been falling apart ever since, although they hate to admit it, but they do not control the whole Western world, which they once did and which they would like to do again. By 1750, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 4 Jesus. It only took 250 years. In 1765, James Watt looked at the steam kettle on his mother's oven and noticed the top jumping up and down and thought the steam was creating pressure. He had 4 bits of information for every bit of information the most educated Roman had in 1 AD. And he was able to put ideas together in new ways. The more bits of information you have, the more new ideas you can get. And he thought, hey, if we built things to deliberately control the production of steam, we could move things and have pistons and wheels and whatnot. And he invented the steam engine, and the Industrial Revolution began to happen, with the usual cultural dislocations and discombobulations that happen in every quantum jump. In 1776, we had the American Declaration of Independence, in which it was declared for the first time that all males are created equal. That was a very revolutionary idea for its time. Tom Paine wrote a book of his own saying that females were created equal to males, so that was too radical to get into the Declaration of Independence. A few years after the Declaration of Independence, Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, the first major feminist work since the Bronze Age had begun the subjugation of women. In 1789, we had the French Revolution. 1798, the United Irish Rebellion. 1810, the first Mexican Revolution. Around then, all the Bolivar revolutions in Latin America. By the time the Industrial Revolution was over, the divine monarchs, the sun kings of the Bronze Age, were pretty much on the run. Very few of them have survived. They still have kings in England, kings or queens in England, Denmark, and a few other places, but they survive only on condition that they don't meddle in politics. The king used to be as absolute as the Ayatollah or the Pope. Now the kings are just figureheads. Democracy is large parts of the world. The Constitution of North Vietnam begins with the words, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all humans are created equal. You can see the influence of Thomas Jefferson in the attempt to update Thomas Jefferson also. Where industrialism happens, democracy, feminism, libertarianism, socialism, anarchism, and a lot of other radical ideas always follow in its wake. And so does a declining birth rate, which is a mysterious thing I don't quite understand. But as soon as a country industrializes, the women decide they're going to have less children. Which is why we are not up to standing on one another's shoulders, though it was predicted by in the 1950s we would be by the 1980s. Population does not continue to grow indefinitely. It only continues to grow in the transition from agricultural to industrial economy, then it levels off. Where was I? 1750. By 1900, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 8 Jesus. By 1950, it had doubled again, and we had 16 Jesus. By then, the computer revolution was beginning. John von Neumann had designed the first programmable computer in 48. By 1960, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 32J. By 1967, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 64J. By 1973, knowledge had doubled again, and we had 128J. At which point Andela completed his study, and I haven't seen anything more recent than that. But all the signs, the number of patents granted per year, the number of mathematical papers published every year, the number of new products on the market, everything indicates that information is increasing at an even more rapid rate. Engineers measure machines in revolutions per second. If you measure the doubling of information in the old Stone Age, you found that it was going in revolutions per millennium. Then it gradually revved up to going revolutions per century. Now it's going then it was going revolutions per generation. Now revolutions per decade. And it looks like we're moving up to the point where it'll be going in revolutions per year. And that is the way the third circuit of the nervous system, the semantic circuit, operates. It's a time-bound circuit, and information accumulates in time. The first sun kings of the first Bronze Age slave agricultural societies discovered that it was possible to train domesticated primates to feel ashamed of themselves. It is also possible to do that to dogs, as you may have noticed. You can make a dog feel shame. You can't do that with a cat. Has anybody ever succeeded in making a cat feel guilty? It depends on the sociability of the animal. The more sociable the animal, the more guilt that can be induced. Social animals want to be approved of, evidently. You can make dogs feel very guilty. You can make human beings feel much guiltier. You can never make a cat feel guilty about anything. You can get 6 dogs to pull a sled. You can't get 6 cats to pull a sled. You can't get 6 cats to do anything together. No way has ever been found to out-stubborn a cat. I said to my wife once, you know, cats aren't as smart as dogs. And she said, they're as smart as they have to be, which is probably the last word on cats. Well, no, she also said once, you know, if cats had exactly the same personality but looked like iguanas, we wouldn't have them in our laps. We'd be